For 3 centuries, from generation to generation, hundreds of millions of factory workers have kept the machines of our industrial world in motion. Who are they? Where do they come from? What do they want? What do they have in common? What are their differences? History has changed them, and they have changed history, altered our way of thinking and living together. Without them, there would be neither space travel nor universal suffrage. But what is their place in the world they have created? The first traces of social inequality, which appeared in Europe just 7,000 years ago, are unimpressive. Skeletons of chiefs buried with weapons and jewels, which symbolize their new power and riches gained through the work of those under their command. Slavery, ancient and modern. Medieval serfdom. But as of the 18th century, a new form of exploitation spread across Europe. It happened in the factories where theoretically free men and women worked, those known as workers. Ghislaine Tormos, a car industry worker.
On a des boîtes avec des milliers de vis. Si on doit prendre 3 vis, on ne prendra que 3 vis, on n'a pas besoin de regarder. Nos doigts sentent les 3 vis. Et combien de fois je prends dans la boîte, je me dis, je vais bien en prendre 5 quand même. Non, il y a toujours ces 3 vis. Si je dois en mettre 4 de l'autre côté, ce sera 4 vis que ma main va prendre. Elle en prendra pas 5. Et on sent si une petite 4e vis veut s'accrocher. Non, c'est assez impressionnant en fait, la façon dont on est conditionné. On est super conditionné. Je suis sûre que même les yeux fermés, on est capable d'éviter les voitures qui passent, tellement le corps, les odeurs, les bruits, le son, et puis ces sonneries continuelles. Dès qu'on fait des bêtises, ça sonne. Ou ça sonne pour la prise d'équipe, ça sonne pour la fin d'équipe, ça sonne parce que vous avez fait une connerie, ça sonne. Donc toute la journée, vous êtes avec ces sonneries débiles. Ta-na-na-na, na-na-na-na. Celle-là, c'est pour les pauses. Et l'autre, c'est... Ta-na-na, 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 ta-na-na. Ça, c'est quand on fait des conneries. Ça, voilà. Donc ça, c'est pour avertir qui, on ne sait pas. Mais alors, vous avez des grands panneaux qui ciblent bien l'endroit. Donc au moins, le chef, même s'il est loin, il sait qui fait sonner la ligne, quoi.
This is the individual experience of each worker. But there is also another reality, engraved in our collective memory since the beginning of cinema. Leaving the factory gates. This was filmed in 1900 in England near Manchester. Hundreds of workers leaving a textile factory. A mass, a class, the working class as it was known. A simple fact, visible to everyone. as told by a worker at the Italian steel mill in Terni, recorded by the historian Alessandro Portelli.
Quando uscivano gli operai dall'acciaieria, quella l'acciaieria Terni, cioè tu non dovevi trovarti nella strada, non incontrati mai quando uscivano le uscite, cioè era la fiumana, ma guarda, pensare ai tori così dove a Pamplona, queste biciclette, perché erano tutte biciclette,
come un fiume di biciclette
e travolgevano tutto, guarda, non dovevi trovarti sulla strada in nessuna condizione, in nessuna direzione, né con l'aria e nemmeno perché venivi sollevato e trascinato via come le anche di fango adesso, di sarno. Quelli era la classe operaia, cioè tu volevi vedere la classe operaia, dovevi andare alle 2 quando usciva il turno, perché entravano un po' la spicciolata, ma quando uscivano era proprio una rottura di notica, come un trombo che occupava tutto il lume dell'arteria. Era una cosa impressionante, ancora negli anni 70 era ancora uno spettacolo orrido, veramente, ti metteva paura.
E lui dice, appunto, è la fine anni 60 e parla di uno spettacolo orrido, no? Orrido, che metteva paura, però contemporaneamente tutti i termini che adopera sono termini di meraviglia, che contemporaneamente, che è un modo che io ho incontrato continuamente nelle narrazioni operaie anche, che è contemporaneamente di terrore e di bellezza, no? Che è poi la sintesi, cioè, questa fiumana operaia è meravigliosa e terrificante, che è poi la sintesi di quello che per i romantici era il sublime, no? Il sublime Giacomo Leopardi, il grande poeta italiano, la eruzione del Vesuvio, terrificante e bellissimo, no? La differenza, questo sublime operaio come l'ho chiamato, è che l'eruzione del Vesuvio, il cielo stellato di cui parla Kant, sono o fenomeni naturali o creazione divina. Qui la fabbrica è un sublime profondamente umano.
The Tyne Valley in the northeast of England. The remains of one of the very first steel mills dating back to 1730. These more recent ruins, as can be seen all over Europe today, are those of the steel mill at Saran in Belgium. The 18th century ruins and the recent ones mark the beginning and the end of an unprecedented revolution, of which the factory workers were both engine and fuel, heroes and victims. Christmas Day, 1977, in Yorkshire, England. The Sex Pistols gave their last ever UK concert. It was a benefit gig for the children of striking firefighters at Ivanhoe's, the former Huddersfield Grand Picture Theatre. Industrial England was in the midst of a social crisis. In Huddersfield, as elsewhere, factories were closing one after another, particularly textile mills, some dating back more than 2 centuries. Because it was the spectacular growth in the textile production at the beginning of the 18th century where it all began. It was made possible by the exploitation of hundreds of thousands of black slaves in cotton fields on the American continent, who provided the raw material at minimal cost. Even before any technical progress, this growth in the textile market totally disrupted the production chain. Until then, weavers who owned their own looms worked at home as a family. They were a kind of subcontractor, buying cotton or flax from a trader in town, weaving it, and selling the finished product back to the trader. But in a quest for greater profits, traders decided to take control of the whole chain. They invested in several looms, which they installed in a single place, a factory. This faster and more rational production allowed them to produce more cheaply. The independent weavers were unable to compete. In order to survive, they needed to go and work in the traders' factories where they sold their labor in return for a salary. This was known as the factory system. Factories became machines for producing the working class, their raw material being the hundreds of thousands of tradespeople and peasants, who in order to survive were obliged to work in the hundreds of textile mills which sprung up across England in the second half of the 18th century. What we know as the Industrial Revolution began with an economic revolution. The new economy, based on commerce and the quest for maximum profit, also caused upheaval in the countryside. The fields around Huddersfield still bear reminders. Alan Brooke is a former miner turned historian.
Formerly, much of this moorland was common land. Everyone had access to it. But in the late 1700s, early 1800s, it was enclosed. And the rich manufacturers and mill owners and landowners and farmers, they enclosed it for themselves. And they marked it off by miles and miles of dry stone walling. And before that, people had depended on the common land to support themselves, were no longer economically feasible. So they were actually compelled to go into the towns and to work in the growing textile industries. The labour force for the first factories was really obtained by compulsion. It wasn't people actually being physically driven by force off the land, but the changed economic circumstances meant that the previous way of life was no longer supportable. And so in order to survive, they had to go into the towns and they had to work in the new factories. And so the compulsion, it wasn't open, but it was there nevertheless. And the enclosures was one means of coercing the peasantry to move into the new industrial towns. It became the dictatorship of the clock instead of the dictatorship of nature. But I think nature is a kinder taskmaster than the clock.
In England, this confiscation of common land was tactfully referred to as enclosure. In the Scottish Highlands, it was more bluntly called clearance. Clearance meant armed men in the service of a local lord evicting peasants from their homes, sometimes in the course of one night, and destroying their houses to avoid them returning. The peasants were replaced by sheep, the wool trade giving particularly good returns. The village of Arikonan underwent clearance in 1848. Arthur McIver is a historian.
Using their fortunes derived from plantations in Jamaica, from trading in rum, spice, cotton, and slaves. The Malcolm of Portallock estate owners, the estate owners here, decided to rationalise their farming methods and undermine the types of farming that had traditionally been done. And effectively, they were looking towards clearing out the tenant farmers to consolidate their farms into much larger units and then to bring in sheep. And the idea behind all this, I think, was to create a kind of farming system which was much more profitable, much more commercial. This forced removal, forced expulsion of Scottish tenant farmers in the clearances through the 18th century and the 19th century had enormous implications. Tens of thousands of Scottish tenant farmers went abroad and or migrated across the industrial cities. So without the kinds of changes that were taking place on the land, without the labour for factories, mines and industrial units in the cities, industrialisation just wouldn't have been possible. In the Highlands and Islands with the clearances, it's the destruction of a traditional way of life, a Gaelic way of life, the erasure of that way of life. Similarly, we take the pattern forward. You've got the destruction and erasure of a working class, a vibrant working class community and way of life and with deindustrialisation in the later 20th century. So yeah, there are, in a sense, repeated patterns over time. Over 2 centuries, we can see a similar disregard for human values, for the community values, the dominance of a kind of faceless competitive system.
Clients of this supermarket in the northeast of England are unaware that they are trundling over the remains of one of the oldest factories of the English factory system. They were uncovered during the building of the store and quickly filled in, leaving just this chimney from a later period to be carefully restored. Founded in 1690, the business which produced nails for the navy and chains and irons for the slave trade employed 300 workers. Craft techniques were used, but assembled in a single place, surrounded by a wall. The master of Crowley Forge provided raw materials, tools, and accommodation for workers, allowing him to control all aspects of their lives. The machines were powered by the water of the river Derwent, like the water mills of old. But the flow was regulated by a complex network of canals and ponds which allowed continuity of production. Among the vestiges, the signature of Crowley himself was discovered. After having tamed nature, he went about taming his workers. He was a pioneer in the subject, and the first to put into practice the famous formula of the comedian Coluche.
Crowley believed that a workforce which was not tired, deprived of sleep, would provide the best efforts in their work, and a bell was rung at 9 o'clock in the evening as a curfew, more or less insisting that the workforce should be in bed and asleep at that time. And the bell was rung periodically throughout the day, at the break times, at the break for meal times, and so on and so forth. Their eye was kept on the ball. The bell rang, they started work. The bell rang, they went to their beds. And the bell rang, and they had a break. So that was the way in which the factory system first started, because at the time the cottage industry workers with the skills set their own pace, they did their own thing in their own time and so on, and they were not subject to the discipline of working to a time scale.
Crowley was also the author of the oldest known factory regulations. More than 100 clauses designed to bend the new working class to the law of the factory. Clause 103 devotes 8 pages just to the subject of time.
Where, as it hath been found by sundry I have employed by the day, have made no conscience in doing a day's work for a day's wages, it is hereby declared that the intent and meaning of 80 hours must be in neat service after all deductions for being in taverns, alehouses, coffee houses, breakfast, dinner, playing, sleeping, smoking, singing, reading of news history, quarrelling, contention, disputes of anything else foreign to my business that does not altogether belong to me. In other words, he's saying, you're working for me. You concentrate on the effort that you're putting into my business, and there is no scope for any of my workers to have drinks, to have coffee, to have disputes with themselves, and so on and so forth. And any of the workers transgressing any of those edicts in his rules would face the court and be accused of not complying with his rules. That should apply today, should it not, in many business activities.
Fritz Lang's film Metropolis. The control of time was at the heart of the new trader economy. Mathematically measured time, synchronizing both people and exchanges. Time, money for some, shackles for others. Until the middle of the 19th century, certain English factories forbade workers to have their own watches under threat of confiscation or dismissal. The control of time belonged to the bosses, who were not above altering the factory clock on occasions, pushing the hands forward in the morning and back in the evening to steal a few minutes from the unfortunate workers. A day's work could last up to 16 hours, not including the often 2-hour return walk between place of work and home. This left workers 6 hours in which to recuperate and to rebuild the strength they would sell the next day. But the bosses said if they had more time, workers would spend it on plotting or drinking. The same argument was used to keep salaries to a strict minimum. If workers earned more than was strictly necessary for survival, they would only work 3 days instead of 6. And the boss's capital, invested in the tools of the factory, would also stop working. Hence the argument often used by bosses before English tribunals. Workers who refused to work 6 days out of 7 were depriving them of their profits, were stealing from them. Jacques Rancière, a philosopher.
Ce qui est central pour définir l'être ouvrier, et du même coup, on peut dire la souffrance ouvrière, c'est l'absence de temps. Bon, normalement, quand on pense ouvrier, on pense le travail, la pénibilité du travail, les heures de travail, mais comme heure, disons, de souffrance au sens de la difficulté. Ou bien, au contraire, on pense au travail ouvrier comme source de fierté et ainsi de suite. Or, ce qui m'a frappé, lorsque j'ai lu tous les textes ouvriers des années 1830, 1840, c'est que quand même, le principal problème, c'est le fait que on n'a pas le temps, c'est le fait qu'on est contraint, qu'on ne dispose pas finalement des moyens de vivre, quoi. Et bien sûr, ce qui m'a intéressé, c'est que quand j'ai relu La République de Platon, parce que je voulais en quelque sorte m'introduire une perspective par rapport à ma recherche sur l'archive ouvrière, ce qui m'a frappé, c'est que Platon le dit, tout au début de La République, il dit que pour que le travail soit bien fait, il faut que l'ouvrier soit là tout le temps. Il n'a pas le temps d'être ailleurs que dans son atelier ou dans son lieu de travail. Ce qui est évidemment une absurdité, surtout dans un type d'économie relativement primitif, celui dont il parle. Ce qui veut dire qu'en réalité, l'absence de temps, c'est quelque chose comme une contrainte symbolique. Au fond, c'est ça qui a été reproduit, on peut dire, un petit peu continuellement au fil des siècles, à savoir qu'il y a des gens, ça peut être les ouvriers, ça peut être les femmes, qui ont leur lieu et leur emploi du temps qui est bien assigné, quoi. et qui n'ont pas à s'occuper d'autre chose. Au fond, il y a cette espèce de grand partage fondamental entre ce qu'on appelait dans l'Antiquité des hommes actifs, c'est-à-dire des gens qui sont capables justement d'avoir la disposition de leur temps, de se fixer des buts d'action, ou même éventuellement de goûter le loisir. Et puis ces hommes qu'on disait passifs, qu'on disait parce que, voilà, ils étaient censés vivre, font le temps comme une espèce de contrainte, une nécessité de tous les jours, sans aucune possibilité d'avoir des vues à long terme, sans aucune possibilité de sortir du cercle de la contrainte et des besoins matériels.
Today in Brittany, Joseph Pontus, an interim worker in the food industry.
On a un chef qui n'est pas méchant au demeurant, qui bosse bien avec nous, qui donne un coup de main, etc. Dans un atelier où les gars finissent toujours à leur pile. Il y a des ateliers où ils font généralement durable, là ils finissent toujours à leur pile. C'était un lundi, donc on était reposé du week-end, tout allait à peu près bien. Il restait 5 vaches à couper. 5 vaches, ça prend 5 minutes. Les gars se concertent entre eux, ils disent « Allez, on n'est pas à 5 minutes près, on va faire les 5 vaches. » Ils font les 5 vaches, c'est la première fois de ma vie que je les voyais faire du rab. Le chef vient les voir, leur dit « Merci, merci ». C'est comme si sa vie en dépendait des 5 vaches qu'il avait fait. Le lendemain, on finit 10 minutes en avance. 10 minutes en avance. On se dit voilà, il va nous laisser partir, il va pas nous faire chier pour... Le même chef, il fait « Ah bah il y a des vaches qui ont été tuées du jour, là on peut s'en tuer une dizaine, comme ça on prend de l'avance pour demain. » Je crois qu'en rentrant ici, à la maison, j'ai pleuré. J'ai pleuré déjà de cette humiliation, enfin... Oui, d'humiliation quand même. C'est complètement comme une humiliation, d'incompétence du chef, qui est un bon bosseur, hein, mais je pense qu'il n'a jamais fait d'école de management ou de ressources humaines ou quoi que ce soit, de ne pas comprendre à quel point c'était du mépris envers les gars de ne pas leur filer 10 minutes. Ce temps-là, il est tellement précieux, tellement... On se rend pas compte, moi je m'étais jamais rendu compte à quel point le temps était précieux. La principale phrase qu'on dit à l'usine, c'est est-ce que quand quelqu'un me demande un truc, c'est non, j'ai pas le temps. T'as toujours quelque chose à faire, toujours. Et là, pour 10 minutes où il s'est rien passé en plus, une petite humiliation supplémentaire et tu vas encore bosser 10 minutes.
Once our valleys were ringing with sounds, oh, children singing, but now sheep bleat in the evening and shillings stand empty and broken. Hush.
New Larnark, a cotton mill from the early 19th century. It's out in the wilds on the banks of the River Clyde, a few kilometers from the old village of Larnark. You're immediately struck by the size of the site, even though this was nothing exceptional for the period. It comprised the factory workshops as well as the dwellings where thousands of workers and their families were housed, people who worked and lived here up until the middle of the 20th century. It's a genuine workers' city, with its own church and cemetery, where you can still find the names of a few Scottish Highland peasants who wound up here after being driven from their villages.
Stood with heads bowed in prayer while factors laid cottages bare, the flames fired clear mountain air, and many were dead in the morning.
Like all the large textile mills of the period, New Larnark stood on the banks of a river, the Clyde, upon which it depended to keep the machines turning. At the beginning of the 19th century, energy sources were still traditional. Early innovations were mechanical, like the spinning jenny, an automatic spinning frame, which became widely used at the end of the 18th century. The spinning jenny replaced the earlier spinning wheel, thereby taking the jobs from dozens of spinners. But it also created a fresh demand for maintenance workers. Retying broken threads required people small enough to slide under the machines. New Larnac employed 500 children, including those rented out to the factory by orphanages, which was common practice at the time. The very nature of the work changed. Craftsmanship, a source of pride for the craft person who could produce an object from start to finish, lost its value. In the new mechanized factories, jobs were divided between several workers, each completing only a fragment of the task which mechanization rendered even simpler. This opened it up to women and children, the unskilled workers of the time. In any case, wages were so low that families could only survive if everyone went to the factory. Children worked from the age of 5. Far lower paid, they carried out tasks totally intertwined with those of adults, and also had to work up to 16 hours a day. Still at the end of the 19th century, the American Louis Hine took these photographs of children in the large textile mills. The new Larnac mill was also a tourist attraction. People came to admire its extraordinary clock, which was said to be linked to the machines so as to gauge output. But the reputation of New Larnac was above all linked to its owner, Robert Owen, a philanthropic and innovative boss. Owen was passionate about phrenology, a new science which assigned human faculties to different areas and bumps of the skull. From this materialistic vision, Owen concluded that humans were perfectible. Rapidly applying this discovery to the factory, he invented the silent monitor, a little block of wood which hung over each workplace and whose colored faces allowed the superintendent to indicate the performance of the worker. White, excellent. Blue, indifferent. Yellow, good. Black, bad. Visible to everyone, Owen claimed that the silent monitor created a competitive spirit within the factory. But Owen's pride and glory was free and obligatory schooling for all the children of the mill. Known as the Institute for the Formation of Character, this was a unique initiative for the time, which used the most up-to-date methods of teaching through images. Important visitors were invited to a dance performance given by the children. It was a vision of this new world which the benevolent patron dreamt of, but which sometimes left an uncomfortable feeling. One friend of Owen's remarked that the perfect regularity of the children's movements made him think of puppets. who would be manipulated by the great wheel of the factory. He considered that Owen exerted absolute control, like that of the master of a slave plantation. But this paternalistic tyranny was better than the straightforward tyranny which English workers suffered throughout the 18th century. Workers' association and strikes were forbidden by law because they were contrary to commercial freedom. Only the oldest professions were organized enough to face the risks, like the London coal heavers, who brought the word strike into the English language with the Great Strike of 1768, during which they forced boats to strike sails, to block them in the docks. In the absence of strikes, other forms of protest inherent to peasant traditions were available. Old-fashioned uprisings, which were spontaneous and violent, were provoked by famine or increases in the price of wheat. These were often led by women. Speculators were targeted and fair prices demanded. There was total social insecurity. With no contract, no protection, at the mercy of market fluctuations, workers were always in fear of the worst, falling into absolute poverty, which the poor laws treated as an offense. Without work or resources, workers were condemned to the workhouse, where adults and children carried out forced labor. Between laws forbidding unions and laws criminalizing poverty, workers who didn't have the right to vote found themselves trapped in the shackles of legislation.
This is Enoch, the Great Hammer. It was produced as a replica in 2012 to celebrate 200 years of the Luddite Uprisings. It is a replica, not the real thing, but I'm sure if called into service to smash machinery, they could still do that today.
And this is the real Enoch, the great hammer which the inhabitants of Yorkshire in the north of England used in 1812 to destroy the new machines which threatened their survival. Today, the hammer stands in a glass case in Huddersfield Museum, surrounded by the truncheons used by law enforcement officers and the sword of one of the soldiers which the government sent in by their thousands to quell the greatest uprising which England had seen since the 17th century. The insurgents were wool craftspeople, carders, and particularly cloth shearers, whose job was to shear wool cloth to make it smoother using heavy shears, which demanded a lot of strength and skill. Operating a mechanical shearer needed neither of these. In 1812, these new machines began to spread across Yorkshire, and shearers reacted by attacking the companies which used them. In the space of a few months, several hundred mechanical shearers were destroyed. Manufacturers offered rewards, the army occupied the region, and Parliament passed a law punishing machine destroyers with the death penalty. Arrests, judgments, executions. But the movement was not just corporatist. The mythical General Ludd, hailed by the insurgents, was a righter of all wrongs in the tradition of Robin Hood. No general but Ludd means the poor any good, proclaimed this entrance pass to one secret meeting.
Come, cropper lads of high renown, who love to drink strong ale that's brown, and strike each haughty tyrants down with hatchet, pike and gun. The cropper lads for me, the gallant lads for me, who with lusty stroke the sheer frames broke, the cropper lads for me.
The only images of the insurgent Luddites which we have are those from government propaganda. depicting them as cowardly pillagers disguising themselves as women before attacking. But in popular folklore, they were heroes whose exploits were sung about.
Night, fine night, when all is still, and the moon is hid behind the hill. We forward march to do our will with hatchet, pike and gun. Great Enoch still shall lead the van. Stop him who dares, stop him who can. Press forward every gallant man with hatchet, pike and gun.
Come all you croppers of stout and bold, let your faith grow stronger still. These cropping lads in the county of York broke the shears at Horsfall's mill. They broke the shears and the winders too, set fire to the Taslim mill. They formed themselves all in a line, like soldiers at the drill.
For the most spectacular attacks, several hundred Luddites gathered at night in the countryside around Huddersfield. There was military discipline. All those present swore an oath, an action which engaged them all the more since a new law punished illegal oaths with deportation to the colonies.
I, on my voluntary will and accord, do declare and solemnly swear that I will never reveal to any person or persons, in any place or places under the canopy of heaven, the name or names of any persons who compose this secret committee, their secret proceedings, meeting place, abode, or anything else that may lead to a discovery of the same, either by word, deed, or sign, under the penalty of being sent out of the world by the first brother who shall meet me. I furthermore do swear that I will use my best endeavours to punish by death any traitor or traitors, should any rise up amongst us, wherever I can find him or them, and though he should fly to the verge of nature, I will pursue him with unceasing vengeance, so help me God, and assist me to keep this my oath inviolable. Amen. So it was very serious stuff, because at that time I actually believed that it would bring retribution to them, if not from the Luddites, then from God. The problem with the Luddites, as with many working class movements, is, especially at that time, that with being clandestine and underground and not being able or willing to keep any written records of the meetings, for example, we don't have any first-hand account of what they actually thought about what they were doing, about what their actual motivations were. It's quite right to see them as being that transition between old forms of struggle and new forms of struggle, the sort of looking both ways, of looking back to the past and the domestic system of production which they wanted to maintain, but also the forms of struggle that were being forced into, such as petitioning Parliament and organising. They looked forward to the new industrial system which they were trying to fight against. So that's why I think Luddites are very important. They represent that transition between old forms of working class and even peasant struggle and the new industrial working class.
The Luddites lost their fight against mechanization, after which their story was hushed up by a workers' movement bent on respectability and technical progress. Only a few local monuments remain, such as this obelisk around which they assembled before one of their attacks. That was in 1812, when the obelisk was in the heart of the countryside. Huddersfield in 1847. 30 years after the uprising, the Industrial Revolution took on a new face. With this smoke from factory chimneys, the train passing in the distance, steam power replaced the early hydraulic power, fixing the image of the industrial world for the century to come. A symbol of modernity and progress, steam power was a gold mine for cartoonists. For the workers, it was less amusing. The introduction of steam power forced workers to compete with machines whose strength and speed had multiplied. As the rhythm became faster and faster, accidents multiplied. That was the price of progress, as was said back then, and is still said today.
J'ai une dame une fois qui m'a demandé, qui m'a dit, mais justement avec l'automatisation, c'est pour le bien-être des ouvriers, vous devriez être content. Je lui ai dit, mais madame, moi, plus un robot va vite, plus je suis obligé moi d'aller vite. Ça n'a rien apporté à l'ouvrier en fait. L'ouvrier il est obligé de s'adapter à la cadence d'un robot et il va de plus en plus vite. Et nous, on a les capacités qu'on a physiquement. J'étais sur le poste des C2, je faisais les petites voitures C2, et je faisais les portes. J'avais plus de 6 tonnes par jour, en fait, en portant les différents matériaux que j'avais à donner pour construire une porte. C'était 6 tonnes par jour, mais aussi il y a le danger. C'est du galva, c'est des lames de rasoir. Faut constamment faire attention à son visage, même si on est protégé au niveau des mains, des yeux, mais il y a toujours cette notion de danger qui est là.
Faced with these new murderous machines, Luddite instincts came back to workers. Like during this Weaver uprising in Silesia in 1844, reconstructed in The Weavers, a German film from the 1920s. We have no direct testimony from German Luddites, but a novel of the time spoke for them. Stefan Berger is a historian.
If we want to do it like the English, we have to destroy the steam engines and raze the houses of torture, that is the factories, to the ground. My 2 boys are lying in bed at home. Until a year ago, they were perfectly healthy. Now one of them is missing a hand, the other a foot. The rolling machine has crushed them. For the rest of their lives, they will be cripples, sitting on the floor day and night to earn a few pennies by laboriously weaving doormats. Herr Süßlich, who's the factory owner, has not given them a penny in compensation. It was their fault, he said, and neither he nor the world at large has any need for cripples. They would be better off dead. End of quote. So it shows the kind of, on the one hand, the perception of amorality of the owners who are only thinking about their profit and have no feelings for the workers who are at the receiving end of the machinery, who are suffering from the machines, who are experiencing accidents and are marked for life by the experience of working with the machines. And the consequences that some of them draw from this is to destroy the things that oppress them, and that is the machines. And the reference here also is to the English, because in England, of course, we see the earliest forms of Luddism and also the most widespread and the most extreme, because I guess it is in England where this new factory regime is first established. So it is 20, 30 years after the English Luddism that we have these forms of machine breaking, say, in the German lands. And of course, the people know that this has already happened in Britain. So in that sense, the British Industrial Revolution and industrialization and also the working class experience in that industrialization become models for the continental workers.
At the very moment when England was inventing a new industrial world, the French Revolution, as seen here by the filmmaker Abel Gance in the film Napoleon, was inventing a new political language, decreeing, at least in principle, the rights of man and of the citizen. In England, this language was taken up by a small group of radicals, artisans, and writers, including the great poet William Blake, a fierce critic of the factory system and of the large factories which he referred to as the mills of Satan. They think they have done me no injury, and are gone to praise God and his priest and king, who make up a heaven of our misery, says one of his poems. But repression in the war with France, which broke out in 1794, forced these English revolutionaries into hiding. Government propaganda lashed out against these bloody sans-culottes and the satanic partisans of universal suffrage. It took particular aim at Thomas Paine, author of the pamphlet Rights of Man, 200,000 copies of which were printed in 1794, and which circulated widely amongst miners and workers to the great disappointment of the authorities, whose partisans would have liked to have seen Paine hanged. After the end of the war with France and the failure of the Luddite uprising, radical ideas came back out into the open and spread amongst workers thanks to several illegal newspapers with evocative names: the Gorgon, the Black Dwarf, the Medusa. These newspapers were systematically banned, the journalists imprisoned, the vendors condemned to public flogging. Workers shouldn't think, declared one English lord, no more than lords should work at looms and machines. Radical ideas emerged. The world is divided into two great classes: those who produce, the productive class, and those who profit, the parasites, was to be read in the Gorgon in 1818.
On the 16th day of August 1819, there many thousand people on every road were seen, from Stockport, Oldham, Ashton, and from other places too. It was the largest meeting that reformers ever knew. With Henry Hunt we'll go, my boys, with Henry Hunt we'll go. We'll mount the cap of liberty in spite of Nadine Joe.
In August 1819, 60,000 workers and artisans assembled in Manchester to listen to the famous radical speaker Henry Hunt, and demanded political democratization and the right to vote for all. The army charged the crowd, leaving 15 dead. The government thereby demonstrated that it was ready to crush any peaceful demonstration with the same force it had used during the Luddite uprising. The St. Peter's Field Massacre, known derisively as Peterloo, as a reference to the Battle of Waterloo, which had been won 4 years earlier, became the official birth certificate of the English workers' movement. This old political banner is a tribute to the victims, exhibited in Huddersfield Museum, a few paces away from the Luddite hammer. It dates back to 1820 and was in all the workers' demonstrations of the 19th century. It demands universal suffrage, freedom for England, Scotland, and Ireland, the abolition of slavery. Am I not a man and a brother? Written in biblical language, this demand was to be the legacy of the first generation of English workers to the following generations. The desire to be recognized as equals, whole human beings, men amongst men.
La première fois, comme dans toutes les usines, c'est l'odeur. L'odeur infecte. Et ce qui est terrible, c'est qu'au bout de 2-3 jours, l'odeur, on s'habitue. On ne se sent même plus. Les premiers jours ici, je venais en bus. Le bus, il s'arrête pas loin là-bas. Et quand je revenais de ma journée de boulot, j'étais seul à ma place dans le bus, il n'y avait pas grand monde à côté de moi. Les gens, ils peuvent aussi repartir par bateau pour aller de l'autre côté de la rade. Et ceux qui bossent ici, on les sent. Mais nous, on ne se sent plus. Et au bout de 2 jours, on ne sent plus la crevette, on ne sent plus le poisson, on ne sent plus rien. Là, je bosse à l'abattoir, je sens plus la viande. Il paraît que j'ai une odeur de mort quand je rentre. Le premier truc qui surprend, ouais, c'est l'odeur. Après, ce qui surprend énormément, c'est ce rapport au temps qui avance de manière inflexible. C'est absolument terrifiant, en fait. D'un côté, c'est le temps qu'avance d'une manière... le temps de la chaîne qu'avance d'une manière effrayante et implacable, et de l'autre côté, c'est le temps de la journée de travail qui n'avance pas. C'est-à-dire que les journées sont infiniment longues, infiniment pareilles. On n'en voit pas le bout. À peine on est sorti de là, on a quelques heures pour se reposer, aller dormir très rapidement. Et le lendemain, c'est la même. Toujours ce monstre de métal là qu'on voit en face. Et je suis sûr que si on revient là dans 20 ans, ça sera pareil. Rien n'aura changé. Il y aura toujours une production à assurer. Il faut que la production continue. Et à l'intérieur, il y a des hommes et des femmes qui sont complètement interchangeables. On s'en fout de leur histoire, on s'en fout de leur passé, on s'en fout de leur vécu, on s'en fout de leur douleur, au dos, aux bras, aux jambes. Mais il faut que la production continue.